My name's Jennifer Daniel, and I'm the Emoji Subcommittee Chair for the Unicode Consortium. I'm here to talk about how we encode things like skin tone into technical artifacts such as emoji. And the first thing I would ask you to do is to really think about how you choose which emoji skin tone to use. Do you have a go-to? Do you use the same one every time? Does it depend on who you're talking to? As an example, I have a friend who's Italian, and I only mention that because the complexion of the light medium skin tone closely reminds them of their own. But I have talked to other people who say that they don't have just one that they always use. They wait for the person they're talking to choose theirs first. The explanation being that they simply don't want to offend anyone. This universal habit of imitating others, aka mirroring, can be traced back to human origins. In order to survive and evolve, humankind had to invent and learn socially accepted behavior. But this goes beyond mirroring. It's well documented that many white people feel uncomfortable choosing the white skin tone as it comes very close to displaying white pride. Reporter Andrew McGill wrote in The Atlantic. He found that white people in the United States were more likely to opt out of using skin tones and chose yellow instead, apparently to really just avoid the decision completely. You could say that for white people, the option of choosing and performing a skin tone provided a real moment of reckoning. They had to confront their whiteness, which is something white people really rarely have to do. Because the truth is, choosing yellow or gold is like choosing a cartoon of a white person. Those hands, the gold hands, match the smileys so perfectly. They also pair nicely with the cats. So there's a certain luxury that white folks have when using gold emoji. Take, for example, our friends who are biracial. A friend, to use their words, looks like a white person who's a little bit tan. So, which emoji should he use if he doesn't want to use white and bring attention to the fact that he's white? If he uses tan, is that any better? Bringing attention to the fact that he's not totally white? Users choose the skin tone that most closely matches their own. But when you exist between two colors, what does it mean to choose one over the other? If you choose lighter, are you saying that you're ashamed of having darker skin? Or are you just using it because it's more legible? If you choose darker emoji, is it symbolic and is it empowering? It's worth mentioning that the rise of the darker skin tones, it's worth mentioning that the use of darker skin tones is on the rise. Following the murder of George Floyd and subsequent Black Lives Matter protests against racism and police brutality, there's been a significant increase in the raised fist with dark skin tone emoji. Emulating the historic gesture of support and solidarity, this emoji has a long-standing association with the Black Lives Matter movement. When employed in desktop messaging environments, using skin tone emoji means drawing attention to yourself as a Black person in mostly white spaces. Check it. Is an example from Slack. When reacting, skin tones are itemized out, creating zones of exclusion without anyone consciously trying to do so. As a white person, what does it mean to click the thumbs up, the white thumbs up, or a darker one? If you click the black thumbs up, is it solidarity with your coworker or digital blackface? As a brown person, what does it mean to assimilate to the cartoon yellow instead of bringing in your own? When someone who is biracial and their identity is basically completely invisible, why are we forcing people to choose which part is more true? Pew Research estimates that about 6.9% of the adult American population is multiracial, and the Census Bureau predicts that the multiracial population in America will triple by 2060. But despite the fact that this identity group is rapidly growing, many Americans still don't know how to talk about multiracial people. Americans want to be able to easily label people by race and put them into one box. So this is all to say that emoji and skin tone are complex, and we're going to talk a bit about how they came to be and how they're used and what we're doing about it. Skin tone modifiers were added to the Unicode standard in 2015 with the hope of better representing user diversity in emoji form. Of the roughly 1,200 base emoji, such as police person or mer person, 106 can be combined with the skin tone modifier. The way skin tones work with emoji is, you can think of them as typographic ligature, right? So you have fingernail painting emoji plus a skin tone swatch emoji, and now you have painting your fingernails with a darker skin tone. These tone modifiable emoji represent humans and include images of body parts, activities, facial expressions, body language. The introduction of skin tone modifiers was justified as a way to, quote, reflect more human diversity. Unlike text or photos, then, their sole intended purpose is to aid in the expression of one's skin color. This was a necessity, largely due to Apple's early design decisions that radically changed the trajectory for Unicode and emoji. In the early days, gender and race was not great, but it was reasonably obscured. But in the hands of designers in California, emoji were designed explicitly Caucasian, and with more race and gender signifiers, we started to see cracks in the system. So despite Unicode guidelines to remain neutral, police officer is clearly designed as a white person, probably a man. So here we are today, opting for more detail instead of less, and a whole fleet of police officers are in our keyboard. When the skin tone modifiers were introduced, they were based on the Fitzpatrick scale, which is a recognized standard for dermatology, and basically is how skin tones react to UV light. So, for example, the darkest skin tone represents skin that tans very easily and never burns. In describing its skin tone changes, the Unicode Consortium released a technical report where it stated, quote, general purpose emoji for people and body parts should also not be given overly specific images. The general recommendation is to be as neutral as possible regarding race, ethnicity, and gender. These early attempts to stick to neutral, in many ways, just emphasizes existing inequities that are present in the world today. It is, and was, possibly naive to think that any kind of neutral default would be possible once skin tones were added. In reality, it reflects a certain bias that already exists in society, which is that white is the default. Emojipedia lauded the decision to add skin tone, making gold the default. Quote, these Simpson-esque emoji might not be to everyone's liking, but they do strive to make it clear that the default characters do not have a particular race or skin tone implied. And that feels right. But, you know, if that were true, how come Abu is that yellow? Paige Tutt wrote in the Washington Post that, you know, designers didn't change the facial features of any of the emoji. That wasn't the intended ask. That task would have been much more involved. Instead, by just allowing for skin tones to be layered on top of already designed emoji, well, she describes these figures aren't emoji of color, but they are just white emoji wearing masks. Apple's default skin tone was white, not yellow. So it wasn't until skin tone variants were added did Apple change their defaults from Caucasian to gold. So this is them before, and this is them after. Before, after, before, after. So if you really look at these, to my eye, when you make them gold, you're almost making them more Caucasian, right? Because they're not so much gold as they are blonde. Nonetheless, Unicode, with a lens on underrepresented languages, really wants to be inclusive of the experiences of the online population, moves forward with these recommendations. When these new emoji rolled out, users cited downloading these brown emojis as deeply affirming, and yet it feels like an impossible game to win. Emoji skin tones are essentially like real life. White people still get to be the default if the smileys are gold. I will say, these emoji were hotly debated. There were concerns that the modifiers would never be used because the number of new emoji being introduced was outpacing demand for them, or they would be used abusively due to their innate link to racial and ethnic identity. However, recent studies suggest that those concerns can be put to rest. First, tone modifiers have proven to be very popular. For example, a fantastic study came out called The Self-Representation on Twitter Using Emoji Skin Color Modifiers by Alexander Robertson, Walid Magdi, and Sharon Goldwater notes, in a corpus of about 0.6 billion tweets, 42% of the 13 million tone-modified emoji instances were tone-modified. A second finding of this paper indicates that tweets using darker skin tone were positive. This group has also done great work to show that these modifiers are especially popular among darker-skinned users who are a minority. The argument being that skin tone modifiers are largely used for self-representation, and that this form of self-representation is particularly important for users with darker skin. Although users with most common tone is typically similar to their own skin tone, they don't always choose it. This study found that while users annotated as having a skin tone, let's say 2, which is the second lightest tone available, very often use tones 1 or 3, while users with skin tone 5, the darkest skin tone, most often use skin tone 4. This analysis suggests that the first effect is probably due to an aspect of representation like hair color, while the second is due to the visual affordances of the darker skin tone, which on most platforms tends to obscure details of the emoji image. Take, for instance, man with beard. Right, this is the Noto emoji design, then the Apple emoji design, and then the WhatsApp emoji design. And they're all displayed in effectively simulating a dark mode experience. And while they're not bad, like I can definitely tell what is going on. It's a man with a beard. They leave a lot to be desired. In addition to being more distinct from the other 4 tones, the darkest skin tone can also make details of the emoji much harder to see. The hair and skin are difficult to separate, while facial features such as the lips and the nose become less perceptible. These issues are exacerbated by the small size of emoji in deployment. Let's take a deeper look at color, as it may provide a possible explanation for why users with the darkest skin tones don't use the 5th skin tone as much as you might expect, and why they overwhelmingly use the lighter skin tone 4 when they do apply a modifier. So let's look at this figure. This figure visualizes the HSB, hue, saturation, and brightness, values in 3 dimensions. The HSB model is an alternative to RGB, which is designed to reflect the way the human visual system produces color sensation. Seeing it visualized this way makes it clear that the darkest skin tone for most platforms is an outlier. The exception tones used on phones is the LG example, actually, but they don't make an emoji font anymore. It's possible that if some of these other emoji fonts used the LG tones for annotation, we would have observed a stronger match between users' perceived skin tone and their most commonly used tone in emoji form. This chart also notes that the gradient from light to dark is not uniformly smooth. The difference between 4 and 5 is perceptibly greater, much greater than any other 2 adjacent tones. Users may therefore avoid the 5th skin tone, even if it closely matches their own skin tone, since it doesn't afford any fine detail. In many cases, this means using tone 4, but in some cases, it may influence users to avoid applying a modifier at all, and this would explain the lower use of modifiers in this group relative to the tone 4 users. So what do we understand about tone modulation? The first thing is the most common event for each skin type is an on-off modulation from gold to the skin tone which most closely matches their own. The second is many people do change the skin tone depending on who they're talking to. The third is that tone modulation can happen within the same message. For example, white fist, brown fist, black fist, but it is extremely rare. I mean, like, it's technically possible for someone to do this, but it doesn't happen very often. While people do use emoji to reference other people, the large majority of emoji use is to reference yourself. And the fifth is, users are sometimes reluctant to choose an identity for another person, so instead, they default to the less identity-linked gold option. So now we're going to talk about when diversity doesn't always mean inclusion. It's worth noting that in last year's release, a Unicode release, we brought in the first multi-skin toned, multi-person emoji, couples holding hands. With the addition of these variants, of which there are 71, I believe, we were really forced to figure out how to make it easier for users to browse and select the right emoji. Apple released a very clever selector that lets you first choose the individual on the left and then the individual on the right to effectively compose the final result. Google also rolled out a paddle design that lets you navigate a spectrum of options, displaying all couples available, so you can kind of peruse and find the one you're looking for. However, WhatsApp's emoji picker reinforces some terrible stereotypes. Despite their emoji font supporting multi-skin tone couples, their UI only allows you to pick couples of the same color. Now, when I joined Unicode, I was scrolling through my keyboard and noticed that there was one body part that had no skin tone support, and that's the handshake. And, trying to understand why. Like, why? Well, it doesn't make any sense to me. And the first explanation was, well, we haven't supported any multi-person, multi-skin toned emoji. Now we have. And we need to find a proper path of encoding for it. So we wrote a proposal, right? Basically, what we needed to do was first create a unique code point for leftwards hand, and then one for rightwards hand, which then could be combined to create a matrix of handshakes. So in about 2 years, maybe your product of choice will let you send this, likely in 2022. In an effort to reconcile some of these legacy decisions and finally bring potentially brown families to your keyboard, Google proposed adding the required 7,000 family variations last year. Here's a little, you can see them all right here. And while some were able to get their font technology to support this massive induction of new emoji, other platforms are not quite there yet. And since emoji really need to interoperate between platforms, everyone has to wait for everyone else so we can lift each other up when we can. If you're interested in the rationale, you can read document L2//20-114R, which explains some of the rationale for why these potential emojis did not move forward. With that in mind, Google had, all the vendors really have to face what are they going to do in the keyboard. Now there are a number of emojis that don't have skin tone support. So one solution that Google has done is created an affordance where when you long press on the family emoji, the other family variants pop up. So instead of the existing pattern, when you long press an emoji and you get skin tone options or gender options, think of this as a numeric variance instead of a skin tone variance. So you click on the family emoji and you get single mother, single father. You get same-sex couple with 2 kids or 1 kid. But well, this is very clever. I do take a step back and I ask myself, like, what about families with 3 kids? Families raised by their father and grandmother. Why is our keyboard limiting what constitutes a family? So as people's emoji vocabularies get larger, and the more Unicode focuses on encoding atomic characters, the more creative and flexible emoji become. Because the truth is, multicultural families already exist in emoji form. It's just less obvious in the current emoji experience. We do have brown families. We have genderless couples of all ages. We have biracial families. We have ginger families. And if your family is just you and your 2 cats, yes, you too are represented in emoji form. But representation goes beyond skin tones in just the people emoji. There's a number of object emojis that also would benefit from some thought. Like, why is our ballet slipper pink? Why are ballet slippers pink? The studies have shown that the pink ballet slipper optically shortens the legs of folks with darker skin. So is there something that we can do when designing this emoji that isn't embracing white as the default. Bandage emoji is another great example of this. Well, most emoji fonts opted for a quote-unquote reasonable medium skin tone. Are we creating zones of exclusion without consciously trying? Should we offer skin tone modifiers for bandages? Is there such thing as a neutral color? Is it white? Is it blue? Is it purple? Or is it just the most medium range of skin tone? But this goes beyond skin tone, whether it's being applied to an object or a person. My job as the chair of the Emoji Subcommittee is to anticipate how emoji will be used. Take the rope proposal, or the knot proposal, I think is how it was originally proposed. It seems pretty straightforward, right? It's a knot. I get it. I've seen knots before, so it's familiar. It's legible at small sizes. And as we're reviewing the proposal for a knot, they cite a number of examples of how it doesn't just represent a knot, right? It can represent nautical experiences like sailing, or more metaphorical, like getting married, when you tie the knot. But what isn't included in the proposal is what happens when you put the knot emoji next to other existing emojis. For example, the tree. Suddenly you go from a very sweet wedding invitation to something that's about suicide, or an emoji for lynching. So, as part of the subcommittee process, it's really truly evaluating about not just how this will be used, but how is it already being used? And what can we do about it? Do we just decline it? Is there something we can do to make that proposal better? In the case of knot, what we were able to do is, well, first, explore other types of knots, then explore different types of materials, and lastly, color. And we were able to land on a compromise where we still got a knot emoji, but it wasn't specifically the way it was originally proposed. We have a box knot here. It still represents two things coming together, so you can use it on those wedding invites, you can use it when you're sailing, but it doesn't immediately trigger the previous associations with suicide, lynching. Okay, moving forward. What are we doing? What can Unicode versus just products do to recalibrate users' expectations around what emoji can and can't do? Shipping features like Google's Emoji Kitchen allows users to mix and match smiley emojis to create new ones, such as stickers, and that's a good start. The focus is less on human representation and more on abstract feelings. So here's an example. You take the cowboy emoji plus the heart emoji, and you get a yeehaw, aw. You take the pleading face and the black hole emoji, and you get a really I'm so sorry expression. And there's a number of examples where when you combine two concepts together, you get something completely new that you don't get when they're just sitting side by side. So instead of face throwing a kiss, you now have a face throwing a little bit of spice when combined with fire. Or you can now combine any emoji with a face mask. And this really brings us somewhere new entirely, where emojis are truly composable rather than just pre-existing assets. Nonetheless, over the years, emoji have evolved from encoding concepts like bird and grinning to becoming stand-ins for one's own identity. Which means that emoji for woman doesn't mean any woman as much as I expect it to specifically mean me, Jennifer Daniel. Representation is not unique to the human form emoji, but also the food and beverage emoji, like animals or drinks or flags. And that isn't to say that human representation isn't relevant. There is a primal human need to be seen, to be heard, and to be recognized. Variation in humans is a lot trickier. For some people, the hair below their nose is their one distinctive feature. For others, it's the hair on top. And hair isn't just about literally hair. It's about your identity. Hair can be used as a metaphor for one's entire essence, and it's the perfect symbol. Black women's hair is one thing that has always been policed throughout history and into the present. But even with hundreds of haircuts, when asked, the most reoccurring complaint about every avatar program that has ever existed, whether it be in games or in messaging, is they're always leaving something out. Bitmoji, for example, which has been around for quite a long time, still offers no customization for physical disabilities like wheelchairs or canes or prosthetics. Which brings us to Unicode. Is a font really the best way to provide a scalable and robust avatar system? How many diacritics can you add to a character? Sure, we will try to engineer ourselves out of this problem, but there are also some really interesting visual design problems to consider. If yellow is a cartoon white, is there such thing as a neutral color? What level of detail can we remove to bring the most equity to emoji? Emoji design has evolved quite a bit from the 90s. This shift in creating designs to show off retina screens has left a critical part of what made emoji useful in the first place. It's harder for emoji to operate like letters or words when they had this level of specificity. The drink emoji used to be the idea of a drink, but now it's very much a dirty martini with one olive straight up, begging the question, why not an emoji of a tumbler glass of whiskey or a tropical drink, or what about a beer? So now we have a full bar, but we're still leaving out your favorite dark porter or a rosé or whatever it is that you like to drink. So if my job is about bringing global representation to the Unicode standard and improving and sustaining equity with the same amount of rigor and intentionality that Unicode embraces as they digitize underrepresented languages, how do we accomplish that? Is it too late for emoji? Or do we have time to save them as we review proposals, conduct meetings, design them, and the experiences? A small voice is in the back of my head asking, are emoji part of the problem? Is there a way to start over? Can we create a path forward so they can operate at the speed of language and perhaps become something entirely new that we don't even recognize? On a Unicode level, the first step means having a much higher bar for inclusion and identifying broad, globally relevant concepts. Because as we add not just more details to emoji, but also adding just more emoji every year, we have over 3,000 now, we are creating zones of exclusion without consciously trying. It also means that design is playing a much more significant role earlier in the process to deliver on this ambition. But it also means not rendering the existing institution more permanent. Mark Davis has drafted some provocative and creative paths forward by exploring other means of standardizing image distribution. He calls it QID, and it's in early development and needs a lot of work, and we're looking for feedback. So please do read document L2/19-082 and help us improve the standard. And of course, if you don't have the right emoji, there's always stickers, GIFs, memes. The entire internet is a wealth of imagery. On a product level, the entire emoji experience could benefit, frankly, if it just evolved. As emoji keyboards currently exist, well, they still largely rely on hunting and pecking like we're still on typewriters. When prioritizing efforts for inclusion, the Emoji Subcommittee pushes itself to make an effort to put our energy into real, radical change and not just looking back on what we have done and how to fix it. And I'm hopeful the Unicode standard and the internet at large is up for this challenge. Thank you.